As Thomas Jefferson once stated, all tyranny needs to gain a foothold is people of good conscience to remain silent. With all that is going on in the world right now, the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrates the impact that can be made by those who are unafraid to speak up. The protests demonstrate that there are important distinctions to be made between the meaning of power. There's two sides to power, the good and the bad. Positive leaders truly care for the unity, justice, and equality of their people, whereas negative leaders exploit their power to manipulate and suppress those who challenge their ability to stay in control. Currently, the justice system of America has proven to be an example of an exploited use of power, and the public has finally had enough. During times like these, Maya Angelou's poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, written in 1969, proves to be more prevalent than ever. The poem, which celebrates African American resiliency and dignity, is symbolic of the oppression of Black people. In the poem, there's a juxtaposition between a free bird and a caged bird, which can be compared to white people versus Black people. Angelou explores how the free bird is able to do whatever it wants while the caged bird is restricted. In our world today, white people feel much more secure and free to do whatever they want in comparison to Black people. What I believe Angelou was trying to demonstrate is that the only difference between a free bird and a caged bird is the cage. Likewise, the only difference between a Black and white person is the color of their skin. All birds were meant to be free, and yet some are chosen to be in cages. In comparison to our modern world, privileged people, or free birds, often take their many blessings for granted and don't always use their power to stand up for the less privileged because they aren't personally affected by it. With that being said, the verse, "For the caged bird sings of freedom," can be compared to protesters crying for change. Many people have had enough of the justice system in America. As George Floyd exclaimed repeatedly, "I can't breathe," no one listened. So, as a result, protests are being held all over the world in order to be a voice for the voiceless and demand for justice and change. Unfortunately, America's justice system is not the only example of situations in which the value of human lives are overlooked by a higher status. Hong Kong is home to a totalitarian government that has no tolerance for citizens who have opinions opposed to theirs. In the 2017 documentary film, Joshua, Teenager versus Superpower, it explains the story of a 14-year-old boy named Joshua Wong who broke his silence against his totalitarian government. Much like the inner party in George Orwell's novel 1984, despite posing as a democracy, Hong Kong's government has used their power to take many of their citizens' basic human rights and freedoms away in order to be able to easily control their opinions. For example, in 2012, they chose to implement a new school curriculum that would focus on promoting nationalism. As Joshua Wong stated in an interview with Time magazine, the curriculum basically tells us, first and foremost, you must support the country, and the country is communism. It's legitimately stating that you'll get good grades if your answers match the government's views. To protest this brainwashing curriculum, Joshua Wong became a leader for his fellow students and created an alliance group named Scholarism. In protest, Wong and his crew occupied the square outside the government's headquarters and vowed not to leave until the government withdrew national education. After 9 days, he not only increased the number of his crowd from 100 to 120,000 people, but also led the government to announce that national education would no longer be mandatory in schools in Hong Kong. Joshua's use of power could be very beneficial around the world as well. In a dissertation written by Peter Simodes, it explains how, in 2015, Rohingya refugees were forced into a mass migration from Myanmar to various Southeast Asian countries simply because of their religion. Recently, studies from the ongoing crisis demonstrated the role the Myanmar army played in the mass migration. In regards to the theme of power and tyranny, the army used violence against the refugees and yet saw no repercussions for their actions. Due to the government's power over their population and army, they ordered the military to do anything, including violence, torture, rape, and murder, in order to drive the Rohingyas away. This unfortunately led to at least 288 Rohingya villages destroyed and over 70,000 people killed. In the most recent coverage from CNN News about the mass migration, the United Nations called for a tribunal over the crisis. In this article, Mark Darusman, the chair of the UN fact-finding mission in Rohingya, simply stated, "Peace will not be achieved while the Myanmar army remains above the law." Unfortunately, right now, for the Myanmar government, remaining above the law is a simple task considering their power. However, as we are able to learn from movements such as Black Lives Matter or Joshua Wong's scholarism, All it takes is one person to speak up for a revolution to begin. So, in returning to my first quotation by Thomas Jefferson about how all tyranny needs to gain a foothold is people of good conscience to remain silent, to rebel against these tyrants, all that is needed is for one person to simply refuse to do just that. When united, the power people hold forces those who are exploiting theirs to make a change. The leadership taken by those brave enough to oppose proves that no matter how powerful an army of tyrants may be, everyday civilians hold the power to make a change. So, to quote Jefferson once again, when people fear the government, there is tyranny. But when the government fears the people, there is liberty.